asked me about my background, my preaching background. And I said, well, I had 30 years of preaching as a Presbyterian minister, and 4 years as a Free Methodist, and 2 years as a biblical counselor. And he said, oh, Presbyterian, have you ever heard of so-and-so? Well, yes, I have. I've heard of so-and-so. He had gone great distance in the Presbyterian Church in Canada. He was a local pastor. He became the moderator of Synod. He became the moderator of Presbytery, eventually becoming the moderator of the Presbyterian Church in Canada. But not only that, he won the Man of the Year award in his town where he was the preacher. He got all the accolades from the City Hall as a member of the Cancer Society, as a member of the Heart and Stroke, and every volunteer agency he was on the board and the executive, and they recognized him as the great man in the community. And I was, wow, that's pretty awesome. And then he told me, well, yeah, that's the guy. And I heard him preach a while back. And this guy, he preached such an evangelical, Bible-based, theologically sound, orthodox message, I couldn't believe it. It was so solid. And when I had a chance to speak to him after the service, and I said, thank you for preaching such a solid, evangelical, biblical, reformed, orthodox sermon. And this pastor looked at him and said, I don't believe a word of it. And that's the kind of stuff that Jesus is talking about as he's talking about hypocrites. Remember we talked about last week, hypocrisy is rooted in the Greek theater where actors would wear masks representing the characters. Well, here's a minister wearing a mask, presenting a certain persona to the rest of the world, and they applauded him, and they gave him accolades, and they carried him on their shoulders and said, we make you the Man of the Year. But inside he was dead. That's why Jesus called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. They were dead. They're all cleaned up, but they were dead. They've got nothing. They were hypocrites. They were experts at wearing a mask, presenting a persona to the world so they could be applauded and be seen as great heroes of the faith. Look at those Pharisees. Look how spiritual they are. Wow. Well, last week we saw how they would, when they would give offerings to the poor, they would go out into the streets, sound the trumpets, so everybody would know that they've given large sums of money to the poor, and people would be impressed. And Jesus said in that passage that we looked at last week, that they, in getting the accolades from the people, that will be all the reward that they will get. It says it twice in our passage today. It said it twice in last week's passage. They will get their reward in full. That's it. The Greek is suggesting there's nothing that can be added to the reward. If you get praise and adoration from people, that's all you're going to get. But Jesus is reminding us of what the reward is. If we go forward, if we remember the passage, Matthew 25, he says, he gave the parable. One guy got 5 bags of gold, another guy got 2 bags of gold, and another got 1. The one with 5 bags of gold made 5 more. And what did the master say to him? Well done, good and faithful servant. That's the reward. There are those who have taught and teach that the reward we're going to get is actual financial blessings in heaven. Here's the question we have to ask ourselves. What need is there for gold and silver in heaven? What use is a bank or an ATM? Oh, just a minute, Lord, I'm going to go to the ATM to get the money. For what? We don't need money. That's not the reward. The reward is Jesus himself. And Jesus is trying to drive this home. These Pharisees were building their lives on 3 devotional practices that were common in the Jewish culture. The first one was giving that we looked at last week, and the ones we're looking at today is praying and fasting. And oftentimes they went together, and so we're going to be looking at them together. So we have to remind ourselves, Jesus is dealing with hypocrisy, and we talked about last week how their hypocrisy turned into a charade and a parade. Right? When you know that you've been deceived yourself and you're deceiving yourself, you want to present yourself in such a way that other people don't see it. So you're going to put on a charade, and then to back it up, you have a parade. And that's what they were doing. That's what they're doing with prayer, and that's what they're doing with fasting. Remember what a charade, the definition of a charade? A charade is a false, empty, obvious pretense where actions are performed to deceive others, despite the true situation being clear to observers. That's what the Pharisees were doing. And I'm sure the crowds knew it. But they went ahead and applauded them anyway because it's probably just better PR. And so Jesus wants to deal with the issue of prayer. So, let's look at this. Let's look at the Jewish culture of prayer as it was experienced in the days of Jesus. They would pray the Shema twice a day. I'm sure you're familiar with the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your strength. That was the Shema. And they would pray that twice a day. And we can pray that in a very authentic, spiritually alive way. And that's what Jesus wants them to remember. The other thing that they would do in that time was called the Shemone Esrei. The law was that the Jews must recite this category of prayers 3 times a day. There are 18 prayers, 18 petitions, 3 times a day, morning, afternoon, and evening. And what happened was that after a while, you start reciting out of rote, and they lose their meaning. You just rapid gunfire. And that's what they were doing, and that's what was becoming. So the Pharisees would walk in the street reciting the petition, and the crowd would go, wow, isn't that impressive? But it wasn't, because it wasn't sincere. They also had prayers for all occasions. And so they would be, if it was a special day, they would pray those on the streets as well. And they would pray in the street corners, they'd pray in the synagogue, they'd pray in the temple. It was always about being the show. Remember, several times Jesus says, when you pray, pray, but not to be like the hypocrites who want to be seen by others. It doesn't say we can't do this in public. It doesn't say we can't give and people be aware that we're giving, but we're not doing it so that we'll be seen by others and be lifted up. It doesn't mean we can't go out and pray together, but to be seen by others. Jesus said, be careful of what your motive is. Be careful of why you do what you do. There's no harm in praying together in public. I'll give you an example. When I first came to Welland in 1998, I got an email that said, hey, we're having a gather at the flag prayer time to pray for city council. So, being my focus in ministry was prayer, I gathered with the pastors who met at City Hall around the flagpole. There was no publicity. There was just us to pray God's favor and direction and wisdom for City Hall. And it was a nice event. That was it. Next year comes, they said, hey, you know what? We should announce to the public that we're doing this. We should get the media to come and do a story as we do this. And half of us said, I'm out. Because they were doing what the Pharisees were doing. Let's do this so it can turn it into a publicity event. That's the wrong motive. The motive is simply to pray God's kingdom, God's will be done in this place at this time. We don't have to have a parade. We don't have to do all that kind of stuff. We just have to be faithful to what He's called us to do. The other thing that was happening was that, how many of you, when you were going to school and we had these memory contests, had to memorize passages of Shakespeare, had to memorize poetry? Anybody? And then you'd line up, right? And then you would recite your passage, bang, 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 like machine gun fire. Do you remember any of that stuff you memorized? No. I can tell you that when I was at seminary, I had to be prepared to write my final Greek exam on any portion of Romans. We didn't know what was going to appear on the exam, but we had to be prepared to either translate it from Greek into English or translate it from English into Greek. I was terrible at languages. So what did I do? I memorized it. but I memorized a different translation, but that didn't matter. I memorized it, and after I wrote the test, do you think I can remember Romans? No. It's a different type of memorization that allows us to remember Scriptures. Meditation, chewing on it, let it ruminate within our thoughts and in our heart. It becomes a part of who we are. It becomes sincere. It becomes real. But when you hear the people reciting machine gun fire prayer, and you ask them, what did you just pray? I don't know, just saying what I was taught. I just prayed the prayer. That's what I memorized as a kid. There may not be any sincerity in that. We have to examine our hearts. That's what Jesus is driving at. The prayers had become, as some of the scholars of the day, garbled. And I got thinking, here's Jesus, the second person of the Trinity. He's the one listening to these prayers. He's God. He's Yahweh. He's the Lord. And so, disciples, when you want to go and pray, this is what you need to focus on. He says, do not pray standing in a synagogue or on the street corner so that you can be seen by others. He also says, and don't be babbling on like pagans. What does that mean? Some have declared so many legalistic ways that we shouldn't pray, but I think we need to really understand the historical significance of when he says, do not babble like the pagans. Pagans. This is not about saying you cannot repeat your prayers. You don't babble like pagans. In that culture, the Eastern people had a habit of hypnotizing themselves by endless repetition of one phrase or one word. You can see it in 1 Kings chapter 18, verse 26. When Elijah challenged the prophets of Baal, he said, okay, guys, you call upon your God. Remember how Elijah prayed? He prayed one sentence. And fire came and consumed the sacrifice. The prophets of Baal danced around for half a day shouting this one phrase. O Baal, answer us. O Baal, answer us. O Baal. Half a day. That's what Jesus is talking about. Do not babble on like the pagans, thinking that by praying a mantra, you're going to get an audience with God. If you are the people of God, you've already got an audience of God. We don't have to go on and on about our prayer request. Make your petition known quickly. Also, in Acts 19:34, when Paul led that young girl who was involved in witchcraft to Jesus, and all of a sudden the financial affairs of the city of Ephesus started to decline because no longer were they involved in witchcraft, they started chanting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians. Great is Artemis of the Ephesians." That was a chant. That was a prayer. Jesus saying, don't pray like that. It's not about mantras. It's about petitions. It's about praying the things of God. And even in the days of Jesus, the Pharisees were accused of doing that with the Shema. Of, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one." They would recite that until they got themselves so worked up into a lather that they would pass out unconscious. That is not prayer. And Jesus saying, don't do that. Don't do that like the pagans, and don't go out into the street to be seen by others. And so, he gave some correction. What did he do? Well, the first thing he corrected was location. When it says, and when you pray, he's speaking to the disciples, that you there is plural. He's speaking to them as a whole. As a whole, you need to be a people of prayer. Disciples of Jesus pray. This wasn't an option. It said, oh, when you feel like praying. I said, no, when you pray. It's not an option. When you pray, what did he say? He said, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. That word there is singular, so as an individual, I go off into my closet and I pray. But we know that from Acts, the disciples spent 10 days in prayer in the upper room waiting for Pentecost. They would pray together, but they weren't doing it to be seen by the city of Jerusalem. They were doing it because God said, go and wait until you receive the power to be my witnesses. He changed the location. Instead of doing it out there, do it here first, and if you have to pray out there, don't do it to be seen by others. Many times I've gone prayer walking. I've just prayed walk the street. I don't go door to door and say, hey, I'm prayer walking. don't bring attention to yourself. Because what happens? Once you start bringing attention to yourself, you start thinking, hey, self, you're pretty important. These people are impressed by what you're doing. Let's do some more of it. And that's where the ego comes in. That's where pride comes in. And then we disconnect and we miss the point. So the disciples would pray by themselves, but they also prayed together. Remember when Peter was arrested? Where were the disciples? They're in a house praying for Peter. Day of Pentecost, they're praying together. Many times they would be praying together. We know that there's some references in Acts that at Paul, he would go to the place of prayer, usually along a river where they would be working, and he would have prayer meetings with the Christians in the morning. So he corrected the location. He modified it so it would be more effective. The other thing that he did was he changed the focus, or he tightened the focus when it came to prayer. Remember I talked about the prayer that they had 18 petitions they would pray 3 times a day? Well, he gave 8. When you pray, pray like this. And he gave what is the Lord's Prayer. Now there had been lots of debates over the centuries of whether we should be reciting the Lord's Prayer or whether it's a pattern. Because those who don't like rote will say we shouldn't be reciting it, we should just be using it as a pattern to point to certain things. And I simply say, let's do both. We can pray it as a pattern and do it meditatively. I pray the Lord's Prayer every day. I even have it on my bracelet here, the Lord's Prayer engraved. It was central to the early church. This is how Christians prayed. And you can take your time. You don't have to rattle it off in 5 seconds. You can use it as a place of devoting yourself to the Lord. That's, remember, these were the acts of devotion: giving, praying, fasting. These were not check the box off, you can go on with your day. This was an opportunity to spend time with him. So he gave, he gave 8 petitions to give shape to a lifestyle of prayer. And he also ends this section on prayer with the importance and the centrality of forgiveness. That was the heart of the gospel. That was the heart of the message. That was the heart of what Jesus was doing. But what had happened with the Pharisees was they had been changing everything as a way to get something from God that they were not entitled to. They were trying to impress God. God, you must answer my prayers because look at what I'm doing. I'm cutting myself. I'm shouting. I'm doing all this stuff like the pagans. You must be impressed. And Jesus saying he is not impressed. So stop doing it. And then he goes on to speak about the culture of fasting. There were requirements of fasting with the Jewish people. On the Day of Atonement, the National Day of Atonement, they would fast all day. But there was also personal fasting, fasting for mourning, national interests, national repentance, for preparation. Moses went off by himself before he went into Egypt. Daniel went into fasting. Jesus went into fasting before he started his ministry. So there are personal ways of fasting as well. The fast days were Mondays and Thursdays. And the Pharisees used it as an opportunity to parade themselves around in this charade of hypocrisy to let the people know that they were fasting. And how did they do that? It said they would disfigure their faces, their hair would be all disheveled, they would sometimes wear sackcloth or whatever, and they would go out looking like they are wretched. And the people say, oh my goodness, look at these Pharisees, they're fasting. They are terrific people. They are so spiritual. God must really love them. Why can't I do that? And they are impressed by that. But Jesus says, when you fast, do not do that. Comb your hair, wash your face, be joyful, don't be obvious. Because those things are just going to reflect what's in your heart, and what's in their heart is nothing. And so, Jesus is all through the Sermon on the Mount, he's contrasting everything with how the Pharisees did everything. The Pharisees did everything for themselves, not for the Lord. And that's what we have to be careful of. I read this, where it says, the spiritual disciplines are for God's pleasure, not for our pride. It's not to build ourselves up. Hey, look, I don't go to Mel and say, hey, Mel, I spent 6 hours in prayer today. Are you impressed? I know what she'll say. No, I'm not. Because you shouldn't be telling me. Tell him. Well, I don't have to. He knows. We don't need to do that. But what is it about our humanity that we feel so compelled to do that? It's because of our old sin nature. We want to be recognized. We want to be affirmed. We want to be confirmed. We want to be built up. We want to be encouraged that, hey, we're on the right track. That's where the enemy hits us. He said, boy, you're doing a good job, Bernie. Keep it up. Go tell people that you're doing that. It sounds so right, but it's not. And that's where we have to be attentive to the examination of our hearts. One of the spiritual disciplines that I think need to be developed in the church, and it's been bypassed, but it's examination of our hearts. The first person I ever read who ever wrote anything about that was actually John Calvin himself. Examination of our hearts before God, so we're not reflecting self, but we're reflecting the glory of God. That's his goal. And so how do we overcome this? Well, we can rejoice, first of all, that our old nature has already been overcome. It has been crucified with Christ. It is dead. But when we allow it to come back to life by circumstances and emotion, it will take over, and all of a sudden we're living in our old ways. So it's been crucified. Keep it dead. Put off your old nature, it says in Ephesians and Galatians, and keep it there. Put your foot on your old nature and say, I declare you crucified because you've been crucified with Christ. I declare I am a new creation. I don't have to live that way. I have all the power within me by the power of the Holy Spirit, according to Philippians 2:13, Ephesians 3:20, 2 Peter 1:3. The power to be the person I'm supposed to be. You repent, you confess, you turn, you embrace, you be filled with the Spirit, you surrender to all that God wants to do in your life, and you're able to live a spiritual, disciplined life without seeking recognition and accolades from anyone else. It's time we just put aside the mask, right? We all do this. I'm not saying about our spiritual, but how many of us, when we go through a line, we could be as sick as a dog, and we go through a line, and someone says, well, how are you today? Oh, I'm fine. I'm fine. We put on that mask. Well, we do that with our spiritual lives as well, because we do not want anybody to know that I got garbage and baggage that I'm still contending with. Well, God knows, Jesus knows, the Spirit of God knows, and he wants to set you free. And the only way you can be set free is when you examine your heart and say, Lord, why is it that I continue to do this? Why do I continue to seek the praise of man for the things I do? And he might reveal it to you. Because you never had it from your parents, but you can have it from the Father. Examine your heart. Let him change your heart, so you don't have to be seeking the praise of man, but you can hear the voice of God saying, well done, good and faithful servant. What do you want to hear? The praise of man or the praise from God? Amen? Amen.